I felt the cry in his voice. I felt the cry. I felt the joy, and I felt the pain.
My name is Yorgos Kyriago Panayotou, that's really how it's said.
It's wonderful.
Yorgos Kyriago Panayotou. To the outside world, I am and always will be known as something else, but it's not my name. As a boy, I haven't read this for ages.
I know.
As a boy, my biggest fear was that my huge ambitions would stay just out of reach of the child I saw in the mirror. So I created a man in the image of a great friend that the world could love if they chose to. Someone who could realize my dreams and make me a star.
Basically, we've been friends since we were 12 years old. And when we eventually got a recording contract, we didn't see any reason to bring anyone else in. We thought the image would be very good, two friends, you know.
Is it true that you were unemployed before you were successful?
Yeah, we were both on the dole.
A friend of mine, Mark Dean, had just launched a label called Innovision, and he decided to sign his mum's next-door neighbour. He was already struck by George's star quality because when he'd signed to Innovision, George went for holiday immediately in Greece for 2 weeks, but flew back in the middle of it to get his hair cut. And Mark thought that was so over the top and so superstar-y.
It was not a good deal.
With young artists, one of the things I say to them in that jubilant moment when they sign their first contract is all you've done is get into the casino. You haven't even started playing the tables.
The actual demo tape that got us the contract was about 4 minutes long, and it was just, we did it for £20 in Andrew's front room.
I first met George when he was an unknown teenager. I met him at a small gay disco above a pub by Manor House Tube Station in North London. He was a great dancer. He used to sing along to all the songs with a very good voice. I remember him telling me, one day I'm going to be a pop star. I thought to myself, well, maybe.
Two cute, gorgeous, bubbly boys, and those voices together, the harmonies. They were box fresh, minty clean, wholesome but sexy. They just had everything from the go.
They were happy and poppy but had a little bit more substance.
I think I liked Wham in the very beginning because of the stuff that I'd read about them having a social conscience and venting about being on the dole, and that appealed to me so much more than them just being pop artists.
They were just the sort of perfect pop package and really smart as well. That kind of intelligence kind of billowed off them, but they didn't make an issue of it. That was the kind of clever thing about George. The intelligence was sort of there, but he didn't really care if you noticed it or not. He was just looking to wow you as a pop star.
Pop became a very dirty word in England for a good 4 or 5 years, but it's definitely definitely the music of '83 in England.
You know, when George looked at Andrew, that was Wham as far as he was concerned.
I actually thought Andrew was the key figure because he was more confident, he looked good, and he wasn't wearing a string vest.
People would say to George, you know, you're the songwriter, you're the singer. Well, what does Andrew do?
Andrew was the kind of look, the essence of it. And I just remember being, you know, immediately struck by their bonhomie. You know, they were incredibly easy to be around. You know, they were funny, they were bright. I mean, they were 18 years of age.
George's father was Greek Cypriot. When you grow up in England, but your parents aren't English, or at least in this case, one of your parents isn't English, the predominant pop cultural form of your time is what you will turn to find out who you are. And pop is more often than not the engine of that realisation. It tells you what you are. At Top of the Pops, I mean, Top of the Pops, For someone like George, was a news programme. It wasn't just an entertainment programme, it was where you got your news from.
It wasn't cool, it wasn't hip, but as far as young people were concerned, it was the centre of the universe.
And it hit 15, 16, 17 million every week.
Who's in, who's out, who's top, who's bottom, and who we need to care about.
And that was how we talked about it in the playground.
Tonight. It's the first chart of November. It's my first Top of the Pops, and it's their first Top of the Pops. Wham!
The debut was very important because the debut was how you sort of announced yourself to the world. And some artists came across sort of quite naive, quite overwhelmed, like they hadn't thought it through, and then there were other artists that had clearly knew all about cameras and about red lights and where to look when there was a red light on. And George had that down to a T. George was like a scholar of how to carry yourself on television.
Well, I haven't seen your face around town a while, so I greeted you with an annoying smile. When I saw that girl upon your arm, I knew she'd won your heart with a fatal charm. I said, soul boy, let's hit the town.
They had their routines, they had the girls, they had each other, of course, and they were clearly going to be stars.
Right, now I'm here in the middle of the newest to massive stereo I've ever been in anyway. Last week I was an unknown and suddenly I've got all these girls around me. Anyway, I hear apparently you're in the process of trying to change your record company or something.
There's a lot of legal difficulties we're having at the moment, which is why we haven't got a single out at the moment, which is a shame.
They had big hit records early on as Wham, but these were dance records sold on 12-inch vinyl. They didn't get a royalty for this.
It's very easy to say that we were all naive and didn't know what we were doing, but, you know, they had lawyers, I had lawyers, so I don't know, really.
Basically, he knew what he was doing when he went to the business, just that much more than we did, and a considerable amount more because he'd been in the business for 4 or 5 years.
All the records they were selling, they were absolutely making zero money for. They needed money to get out of the Innovision contract. The plan was them going on tour and creating Wham Mania.
I went to see them at Hammersmith Odeon, where both Andrew and George were putting shuttlecocks down their shorts and then batting them out into the audience, which seemed pretty gross to me at the time.
I must have been one of the only 12-year-old boys there. I was there with my sister.
I must have seen thousands of gigs, but that one, I remember where I was standing, looking up at the stage and just watching this ridiculous kind of cabaret happening on stage.
Bela sponsored the tour, and George and Andrew took, great perverse fun at Whitley Bay Ice Rink, which was the coldest venue this side of the Arctic Circle, and I remember having jeans on and a chunky jumper, and George going, "You're not going on like that." I said, "What are you talking about? It's freezing out there." No, Gary, you've got to deal with Fila. You've got to put the shorts on and the t-shirt. What?
Actually, the joke was on George, because halfway through the tour, he was the one who ended up in bed with bronchitis.
How are you actually feeling now?
On the mend, definitely on the mend. The voice is still not quite back yet, but I feel fine otherwise, really. But he's better now, isn't he?
During the tour, you started to hear this word, Wham Mania. On the front pages of the newspapers, this was splashed. And you saw the tension build and the excitement as they conquered the country.
This was excellent because it would provide money to fight the court case. Innovision, they were a subsidiary of CBS, and so the plan was to force CBS to keep Wham and say cheerio to Innovision.
I think Mark Dean had an amazing eye and ear for talent, and he correctly spotted George's potential.
I think one could feel a little bit sorry for Mark Dean because he did provide great initial impetus.
Very self-determined young man, totally in control of what he wanted to do.
George was pretty ruthless and knew what he wanted, and Mark provided the stepping stone for him.
They moved from something overtly political to something far more hedonistic. It was as though they had received Thatcher's memo that your money is to be made and enjoyed.
Thought this has got to be #1, and it was.
I remember talking to Ray Parker Jr. in his studio in Los Angeles, and he was saying, "Guilty feet have got no rhythm." Damn, that's a good line.
if you're obsessed with pop, if you're buying those records, your whole life is an apprenticeship for those moments when a careless whisper lands into your head.
I can just remember being a songwriter in Germany, hearing Careless Whisper for the first time on Armed Forces radio. And I remember thinking, how can a guy, you know, so young, write something so beautiful and mature? It was so elegant and mature and so full of some kind of French boulevardier, his vision of life, like Aznavour, some of these guys who've seen life and they're kind of even a bit, you know, the sang-froid is like just overwhelming. Like, who the fuck are you that you're a teenager and you're writing things like Careless Whisper?
The answer was that George, despite having written a pop masterpiece, was just a teenager having teenage fun.
Sarah Jane Barker's on the line. Hello, Sarah Jane Barker.
Hello.
Hello. Hello. They're all yours.
George Marcus, what things make you angry and how do you show it?
What things make me angry? And how do I can slam the phone down?
Make me see.
Oh, I make George angry. Andrew makes me angry, yeah. And how do I show it? Well, I make the occasional solo record and say, you're gonna act that way, geezer. I'm off.
I just like the fact that on Wake Me Up Before You Go Go, he actually sings, I'm not planning on going solo. And then the next record's a solo record.
We've got a new single coming out. It's a brand new one.
Great.
Called Last Christmas. Sleigh bells and everything.
Oh, really?
And the cover is amazing. You've never seen us look so stupid in your life.
The lyrics were so clever, and you know, it might have been about teenage angst, and it didn't matter what age you were at, whether you were going through it yourself or whether you'd been through it, you could relate to what they were saying. So you'd see the video for Last Christmas and it would just be so plaintive and so painful and so brilliant.
Of course, Last Christmas is the best-selling #2 of all time because it was kept out of #1 by Band Aid.
Last Christmas is a song that is obviously going to snare the mums and dads and the grands and the kids and stuff. But of course, on the flip side, you've got this song like Everything She Wants.
Somebody told me, or everything she wants is everything she sees.
Those lyrics are painful. It just gives you a physical reaction to it.
It was kind of ostensibly about a girl, but actually it was also a metaphor for capitalism and the way capitalism works in the modern world.
So why not become the capitalist world's representative of youth culture and go to communist China? And take along a world-famous film director with you, Lindsay Anderson, and make a film of it.
I thought it was quite an inspired choice, I've got to be honest. You know, Lindsay, very left-wing filmmaker, you know, pop band, going to China first time, you know, closed borders, terrified of the Western world kind of thing.
But, you know, we were dealing with a country that had never seen this before. They just brought everything in from the airport on flatbed trucks. If it had rained that day, we'd never have played China.
The audiences were extraordinary because they weren't allowed to clap. They weren't allowed to really respond. They're not allowed to shake, scream, or make any kind. And there are guards on all the tiers, all the way around the auditorium.
The police were trying to contain the crowd, telling them not to stand up. The Chinese audience were pretty well behaved, but the foreigners in the audience were going crazy. They were all up dancing. The speakers were so loud. Boom, boom, boom. Our Chinese concerts were never that loud. My heart was jumping out of my chest.
It was very obvious that they actually wanted very much to be able to appreciate what we were doing, even though there was no precedent for them, and even though they obviously had no idea of how to react to a concert, a Western concert.
As a kind of seminal moment, I think what Wham in China did was mark them out as different from the crowd.
Motown returns to the Apollo! And starring Debbie Allen, Tempest Bledsoe, Lisa Bonet, Keisha Knight Pulliam, Patti LaBelle, Little Richard, The Manhattans, Marilyn McCoo, George Michael of Wham!
The idea of doing something spontaneously as we did then, maybe he felt a little, maybe nervous, and I just told him, I said, don't tense up, it's all good. You know, we could. You know, he had a great voice, It was fun. We just, just said, let's just have a good time.
So don't go away.
He was having hair extensions put in for this different corner shoot. I just remember looking at him and thinking, why are you so sad when everything's going so well, I mean, you just had an album which is getting on to sell 20-odd million records in a year. And none of that success at this point seemed to be making him, to any degree, happy.
Take me back in time, maybe I can forget. Turn a different corner and we never would have met. Would you care?
A different corner is the first time where you can feel the sexuality of the man, not just as a subtext, but as the context of everything he's doing.
It certainly felt as though we were being given access to another side of him completely.
It's clearly the work of a confused person, but it's heartfelt, and you want to help this guy.
It's a beautiful song which you can read about a man absolutely fighting the tenets of the central tenets of his sexuality.
Forget the composition, just the way he presented that super confident, brave song.
He used the image to focus people's attention more by reducing it, by making it simpler, by making it more austere, if you like, more like a Rembrandt late self-portrait, so that you only focus on the sound of his voice and the words that he's singing.
Shortly after A Different Corner was released, George announces the end of Wham and a huge concert at Wembley Stadium, the final. These three amazing dancers, very sassy, all dressed in black, and George is the middle one. No sign of Andrew.
He's going to do that thing, and he's going to do it on his own.
It struck me that this wasn't Wham's last gig. This was George's first as a solo artist.
Best. Quite simply, she's the best.
And when Aretha turned up in the limousine, she had just come from her fear of flying course. She had an abject fear of planes. She was trying to get round it, and that day they'd reached the stage where you go hurtling down the runway, but you don't actually lift off. So she was kind of nervous having come through that. The pair of them just hit it off instantly. You could hear it on the song, the ad-libbing. It just worked out very well.
The Aretha video shot in Detroit. George and I flew to Detroit and we went to a studio which had been booked. Aretha arrived with 30 people and 6 limos, basically. And the interesting thing is, people think it was shot in different places because the shots of him and Aretha don't quite look like they're together, and they were. And what we found was that Aretha wouldn't look at George when they were singing. She'd only look at her entourage. So for her to get a kind of eye line to George, we used to have to move her entourage all the way around the studio, behind his shoulder, so it looked like she was singing to him.
Any artist who wants to have a career in music has to have a public image, and it has to be separate from your private self, otherwise destruction is lurking on the way.
It started with the styling, so the jacket, and then I found the guitar at this pawn shop. He had a stylist in LA that he didn't like, and Mel, his sister, and I went down Melrose and found most of that stuff in leathers and treasures, and there was a jacket with revenge on the back, and then he put his pearls on, you know, which was his kind of secret sign of his sexuality.
The public image has to have its roots in truth, so it has to be some aspect of yourself that is true, but then you are performing that person.
Sex is natural, sex is good. Not everybody does it, but everybody should. Sex is natural, sex is fun. Sex is best when it's one-on-one.
I honestly can't think of really a more tasteless verse than sex is natural, sex is good. Not everybody does it, but everybody should. I mean, that would rank really as one of the most banal and trite three lines in rock and roll.
I don't think it's trite. How many people have you met in your life that you think are better for not having sex? If you think about it, sex is natural, sex is good. No, everybody does it, but everybody should. I genuinely believe I think sex is a natural part of life. I didn't say have it now or have it when you're 12 or have it when you're 14. I said everybody should have sex. I'm not going to sit and think, well, they wouldn't fancy me if I wasn't a pop star, or if I wasn't a singer, if I wasn't rich, because I am all those things, you know.
Once you create a persona for yourself in public for your career that's separate from your private persona, but then you blow it up to cartoon-like proportions.
I gotta have faith. I gotta have faith. Because I gotta have faith. I gotta have faith.
Faith. I like that.
I gotta have faith.
You take some music and put an image with it, okay. Take some music and put what George Michael did with Faith to it, wow. You know, then it becomes a work of art.
And it is its own commercial masterpiece. He was the only British artist who was competing at that level.
When the Faith tour came along, that was on George's shoulders completely. There was no Andrew anymore. So George definitely ramped his game up.
He decided he wanted Americans in the band. So we trundled off to New York to get musicians, and then LA, and then we got a bass player, a guitar player, and a background vocalist from there, and that then became the band. And I remember the sound check when he suddenly realised that he had musicians behind him, and we weren't machines. I could see it turning in his head, I've got real musicians here. And then that's how we got to do Stevie Wonder covers, because he suddenly realised that he had people that could actually play that stuff, you know.
He knew that this was all on him, and he was far more involved in the planning stages.
George always wanted the record live, because I'd made that mistake on Faith of rehearsing with the American band and putting a little extra guitar here and a little bit. He was not pleased when he heard it. He wanted everything absolutely the same and every night.
He was far more aware of what was going on and how this thing was building towards what ended up being the biggest world tour in 1988.
Faith had this incredibly long run at #1 in the States, won the Grammy and so forth, and produced 5 #1s, I believe. Incredible.
George Michael.
George Michael. George Michael.
He came down into the lobby of the Bellage Hotel, and George had the ripped jeans thing down, you know, long before it became fashionable. He had this sense. George had this sense of what was going to be cool. And he walked down into the lobby of the Bellage with these ripped jeans on. And I went, listen, mate, you know, we're just sort of breaking here in America. This is a pretty cool restaurant and there's a dress code down there. And he said, listen, come with me, he said. I'll show you why a dress code doesn't matter when you're George Michael. And hey, we got out the limousine. Now, George put his leg out the limousine. I could see the security guy at the door looking at his jeans going, he's going nowhere. But then George followed his legs out the limousine and the doors just flew open, you know? Best table in the house.
He's suddenly a world superstar, and I think that scared the life out of him because Faith had made him such a, you know, it was such a strong image, and record company wanted to turn him into this celebrity.
That was the kind of period when he just didn't want to be seen by anyone, you know. He was upset that he was mobbed when we came off a plane from LA or somewhere. And he had a cowboy hat on, pointed cowboy, but you know, he had all the faith gear on. And I said, well, why don't you dress down a bit, you know?
The problem is, once you are seen in that light, once they realize the money in you, and they see that you are a golden goose, the complete focus becomes about that.
They were trying to control him and, you know, keep him doing promo all around America for months and months and months and, you know, being on every TV show and chat show and...
Are you gay?
Am I gay? It's a pretty direct first question.
Although pop is all about theatre and performance, it has to have an authentic core.
No, I'm not.
There was a mismatch between what George was presenting and who he was.
But the main thing I like to express is that I don't think it's anybody's business.
Most people seriously underestimate what that kind of pressure is like, that goldfish bowl existence.
What I'm saying is I don't think it benefits anybody listening to my music to know whether or not I was in bed with a dog or a man or a woman last night. You know, it doesn't make any difference.
Life seemed to be getting very difficult for him.
The way he marketed himself, he made a rod for his own back.
So the question about George is that, having created this passion play, having created this conundrum, how the fuck do I get out of it now?
He was the most successful recording star in the world, but he was basically unhappy.
If I use an analogy of American baseball, you were no longer able to hit really cool singles and doubles anymore. Everything had to be a home run or a grand slam out the park, and there was no visceral width to the situation anymore.
This is the moment that he turns from being a Janet or a mega star on the global stage to being one of the most serious and interesting songwriters of his generation. He does this meditative, sad, hopeful, beautiful suite of songs.
The music usually came first. So we would construct some parts of the song, and that may have been constructed with just George and a drum machine and some basic keyboards. George needed the focus of the songs to be on his voice.
George wasn't a fantastic musician. However, what he was able to do, he could hear that music. And he would take quite a bit of time to work out how to actually play that music. He was using incredibly expensive studios as almost like demo writing sketchbooks.
The drum track is this. Hopefully it should come up now.
He particularly hated cymbals and tom-toms, so the music became very simple. Everything had to be in his earphones as he was singing it. So he'd say, no, the reverb it's still not bright enough yet, make it brighter, make it longer, make those S's and T's last longer. I need every one to disappear into the distance. And he needed that part of the process to be right before he could move on. And he would then start to write words in the studio, sit in front of the microphone.
And just build it up line by line.
Singing them, see how they sound, recording them. No, it doesn't sound right. Change it. It's like an artist with a brush and no, that line's not right. Get rid of that line. Try this new line, because it's got more impact, it's rhythmically better, it sounds better, the consonants are better. Well, let's say Praying for Time, for instance. If you go to a song like Praying for Time, we had a band to record the rhythm track. He sang the lyrics as they came into his head.
These are the days of the open hand. They will not be the last. Look around now.
It was a way of working that I'd never ever seen before. There was never any lyrics written down, ever at all.
And he changed the lyrics as we were recording.
Praying for Time is his masterpiece.
It's a real anthem against poverty and injustice.
there comes a point where you have to write something which you have not written before, and which your interest in any particular topic or subject will inspire you. And that's why I suppose eventually most lyricists do approach wider topics than sex and love.
You can listen to Praying for Time, and it's completely consistent with this kind of character who is trying to be worthy of his fame and what's happened to him. What is my fame good for? How's it made things better for me?
He understands that really good art gets reinvented in the heart and the soul of the person experiencing it. Every person experiences it slightly different, and that's quite important to preserve.
The best pop songs are like Rorschach tests, like the ink blot tests that psychologists give to patients, where they see in those shapes whatever is going on for them. And in a way, pop stars are like Rorschach tests too. People project onto them the person they want to see, and when they become devoted to a particular artist, it's because they perceive in that artist something that they're missing in their own lives.
I don't believe that I am important as a pop star. I don't think that there are many people that are important as pop stars in the sense that they used to be. I don't believe that I will leave a great mark as an entity, you know. I want to leave something as a writer.
At the centre of this beautiful suite of songs is a song, Freedom 90, which is about him shedding his faith image, it's shedding his fame skin. Suddenly it's about artistic reach being everything. They burn the faith leather jacket in a closet. You could not get anything any more symbolic than that.
He was saying, I'm not that George Michael that was in Faith anymore.
But I never wanted to be someone else. I wanted to be a star, and I wanted people to love me and recognise me in the street. As a child, that was what I wanted, but I never really wanted to be someone else.
But you don't have that many supermodels in your videos unless you want attention.
Fame is the worst drug of all. I've seen it destroy people.
There is no drug human beings will ever come in contact with as powerfully narcotic as fame.
To be there and then down to be here is for some of them more painful than any drug addiction.
The dynamic is, yep, I want to be famous, I love fame, I like the attention. On the other hand, don't disturb me, I'm a private person, I want to close the doors, I don't want perhaps outside my house, I don't want people investigating this.
It seems to me there's always a paradox. What Jung called the tension of opposites.
He loved fame and hated it. He loved the media and hated it. He loved music, but also hated the system.
So there's the paradox. On the one hand, what you long for is anonymity and your individualism and your privacy in a public space. And on the other hand, you're required to play the game and to keep up appearances and to put on a show from the moment you get out of your front door.
It is true, yes, when you put yourself out there as a performer, then you know your life belongs to the public, but your soul belongs to God.
When he was at his most happiest was, I would say, after rocking Rio. He was fantastic.
He met the man who was going to be the love of his life, Anselmo Filipa.
He was so happy. He was a joy to work with. The sense of humour. Anselmo was a great bloke. He'd come to the gigs, sit in with the band before, have a couple of beers with everybody. We assumed that was George's partner. We never introduced Anselmo at all in that way. Anselmo was great to have around. We all knew. You're amongst friends, it's fine, not a problem. But for him, psychologically, there was a problem.
He then had the conflict of not being able to tell anyone about this.
Cypriot culture around sexuality is you'll bring shame upon the family.
Since he came from an immigrant family and I had come from an immigrant family in America, I then felt quite a bit of empathy for him, of the torture for coming out for him.
It's a very difficult childhood. Father Greek immigrant, which wouldn't have been easy, worked incredibly hard, disappointed having 2 daughters to start with. George came along, thrilled, but George wasn't the son he wanted.
As soon as a boy realizes he's a disappointment to his father, there's such a crushing feeling. It's like a cold hand gripping the heart.
Jack wasn't a bad man. He grew up himself with these Greek patriarchal ideas that, the son follows the father, and his business by this time was successful, and of course in that high expectation, traditional way, had expected George to go into the business.
I spent my whole childhood between 7 and about, really until the day that I got my record contract, having rows with my parents, specifically my father.
And during family rows, he would escape to his bedroom, lived a fantasy life.
The experience of not being loved, not being properly seen, heard, attended to, validated, is traumatic as well.
When you're troubled or you've had trauma, a way of dealing with it is to sort of reinvent yourself, is to create a number of personas over the years, try them out for size. It helps you push back the bad stuff.
That I know Master George struggled with in his life as I did. I was just looking for my father to say, I respect you, I respect your way.
A lot of creative artists are initially driven in their childhood by a bad relationship with their father. It's later in life that they come to realize that that bad relationship has led to their creativity.
Trying to become famous is a way of getting validation for yourself as a person that you don't feel in a personal way, because you feel you are the person your parents warned you against. But if you can get lots of people to love you on a stage, that will kind of make up for it and validate you and make you a worthwhile person. If they find the love that they were seeking from the crowd in an individual who will nourish them and give them that support and love and validation, then something interesting can happen in their career.
For the first time, George was really, really happy. They spent time at George's fabulous home in California, and Selma travelled with him for concerts and that sort of thing. But tragedy struck.
There is now a danger that has become a threat to us all. It is a deadly disease and there is no known cure. The virus can be passed during sexual intercourse with an infected person. Anyone can get it, man or woman.
Anselmo was diagnosed HIV positive.
For the man who once sang, wise guys realise there's danger in emotional ties, my God, because of a disease that there's no cure for at that point, you probably are thinking, I knew, I was canny, that was my insurance policy against this heartache.
Queen said tonight they were planning a big musical event dedicated to their lead singer, Freddie Mercury, who died last night of AIDS.
George, knowing that his great love was seriously ill and might not survive, had to go on stage and be George Michael.
That's a performance you've been rehearsing your whole life for.
But knowing Anselmo was there, he wasn't just performing it, he was living it.
How he had the nerve to just pull off such a moment of perfection.
Anselmo died, and George wrote his mum and dad a letter explaining what had happened to him. And of course, his mum was absolutely horrified that he'd gone through all this without her knowing. And his dad responded also in a very sympathetic way.
It's a ridiculous situation to sign a contract when you're 18 years old and be held to it for your entire professional career. I am bound to a very old contract. The end result is that I'm still a very wealthy man, so really I can understand people thinking he should shut his mouth. But the principle is wrong.
George reacted to Anselmo's death with anger. There was an allegation at this time that one of the executives at Sony had described George Michael as a faggot. When this got back to George, he told his lawyers that, come what may, the arrangement had to come to an end.
The copyright belongs to the record company. They have loaned the artist the money to make the recording. If an artist repays all those loans and the cost of production has been paid off, the copyright doesn't return to the artist.
I think that's what upsets artists the most, is the fact that they have made the records. And especially true artists, they've kind of put their heart and soul into it. They've actually made a personal investment into the record. And to find that then somebody can lock it away.
Imagine you go to the bank and borrow money to buy a house, and you place the deeds of the house in the bank's vault. You pay the mortgage, and the bank keeps the deeds and continues to own the house.
There isn't one other industry that operates on this basis.
The music business uses you, so you're allowed to use it back.
The lawyers often were on both sides of the fence. The lawyers were often representing a lot of the senior executives in the record company, as well as representing the artists.
Label bosses and label heads of A&R have got just as big egos as artists, but they haven't got the release of all the glory. So they very often are quite hard on artists.
This is one industry which has been getting away with the kind of stuff that the film industry and the sports industry and the publishing industry and just about every other industry has had to address. You know, the right of the individual, the freedom of the individual has been obtained in just about every other industry.
After 3 days, I knew it was a no-go. Just look at the judge. The judge was a property lawyer. As far as they're concerned, Sony had a piece of property.
The judge who's trying him, he's seeing a guy complain about the nuances of the life of a very beautiful young superstar, a very wealthy superstar. And I remember thinking at some point that wasn't going to play well.
It's a horrible time of life, that was, going through a 3-month lawsuit when you know you haven't got a hope in hell of winning.
I am shocked and extremely disappointed at the judgment of Mr. Justice Parker.
When Mr. Justice Parker sent down his judgment, the clue is in the first paragraph, because he refers to George being a wealthy man.
I think we all realised that he had made so much money that it seemed a bit churlish to be splitting the difference over a contract. On the one hand, we'd heard how grown up he was and how independent and how self-assured, and yet we were being told that he was some kind of little patsy being played around with by the record company.
The perception was that the men in the suits and the record executives that came over from New York were serious businessmen, and this was a whiny recording artist who had made lots of money and wanted more.
Even though I both created and paid for my work, I will never own it or have any rights over it. There is no such thing as resignation for an artist in the music industry.
And peppered throughout the judgment, he refers to the amount of money George has made. At one point, echoing a statement made by Sony, George Michael was going from being excessively overpaid to being grossly excessively overpaid.
When you get into court, you know, it's a pretty vicious, dirty place.
Litigation is hideous. It's exhausting. It's unbelievably stressful. For an artist to voluntarily do that is a real tribute to the strength of their feeling.
they do understand how important it is for us to create, and they will always have that particular leverage. You have to face yourself and say, what's more important to me? Is it going further in this fight, or is it getting back into writing songs and making music? You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for a greater sense of what could make the industry also greater, because it's not necessarily an industry that's ever embraced change, even when that change has been clearly to its benefit.
All I know is, in this situation, I can only move up from that position. I mean, I've lost everything in terms of what I tried to achieve with this action.
What happens now?
Well...
What about if they said, George, we'll release you? Absolutely. We're not going to even ask for a transfer fee, as long as, just as a parting gift, you give us one final album.
I couldn't do that.
He knew he was going to lose. He knew it. He was a realist in things like that. But as he said, you know, OK, so we'll lose. They win a lawsuit. I'll never make a record for them again. And when I do, somebody else will pay the legal fees.
The legendary music mogul David Geffen went to Sony and said, look, George is never going to record for you again. Why don't you sell his contract to me? Then at least you're covered and we can all move forward.
We're in the studio and George is beginning to write the lyrics to Jesus to a Child. They're coming at me with this gorgeous Latin music, and it is heartbreaking.
What I liked about George's voice were songs that were talking about, you know, painful situations, and I felt the pain.
When he suffered the loss of Anselmo dying is when the very personal songs started to surface, because he'd had his validation, he'd lost his validation, and there was nothing else to do but tell the truth.
With older, George again had gone through like a grieving process with Anselmo, and what prior to me like turning up on this record, I just turned up as a 25-year-old kid, just full of positivity and anything was possible. George just had a unique tone. I can't understand the magic of it, but some people have just got a tone that just works. It just goes into your ears and it works in your brain, it goes down to your heart or wherever else in your body. It just is a lovely thing to listen to.
5 o'clock in the morning, you ain't home. Can't help thinking that's strange. Yeah, baby, I just want you to know I won't go through it again.
Spinning the Wheel, his absolute masterwork about safe sex. These are incredible songs. These are songs that are like nobody else was writing music like that with that subject matter at that time. And this is where he's starting to present himself as a peerless documenter of gay men's interior lives.
When I first met him, George hadn't even come out, so even that was very much of a kind of secret. There'd be stuff about lyrics, and I think I was such a fan, I didn't ever want to ask him to kind of spoil that kind of illusion, which is bizarre, even songs that I've kind of, you know, written with him.
When Fast Love came along, I just thought it was one of the best records I'd ever heard.
Fast Love on his original demo was like a Latin kind of ballad. It was like a salsa, very chilled out kind of thing. And I just put on my disco pants.
George had this way of giving you something that created a sort of a dialogue between your hips and your heart, but also your head.
We spent about 3 months on it, and I thought, that's it, it's done, it sounds great. He comes in, he's like, I want the track to turn into Forget-Me-Nots. And he's like, what are you talking about? And like all things, like George would say stuff and you'd kind of be like, it's just a terrible idea. And you do it, and it was an absolutely brilliant idea.
On one level, you could put it with his kind of up-tempo disco club hits. There's an underlying bittersweetness to that with the Forget-Me-Not sample, where it's kind of, there's a pain in there as well. It's like, yes, let's go out and it's about, you know, anonymous sex, it's about one-night stands, but then also it's about the pain and the loneliness that comes with that at the same time.
Fast Love was when the layers fell from even the most naive eyes, and we thought, hang on a minute, what is George Michael actually singing about?
When we were filming George, it was almost like working with a Hollywood icon. It was like he knew the exact angle that he'd obviously worked out in the mirror. He always had to see himself reflected in the matte box of the camera. So if you would like to pan off him, and then he'd go, whoa, 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 stop. And he couldn't see himself, he'd have to start again. So in the end, we invented a kind of little playback system where he could see himself through the lens of the camera and get a really, and so it was almost like performing to himself. So, and then he'd let you edit it, but he knew exactly how he wanted to edit it. And it was always in his head, and we'd show him a cut, and he'd go, yeah, great, and then it would be, okay, start again.
We met end of May, and by the middle of June, I came home, and he said, darling, I want to show you this jumper in the back of that. And he took me back to the house. I'm like, jumper? I think of that as like something a cheerleader wears. It's all stretchy, one piece, you know, our girls wear. And so I went back there, and he pulled out these 2 rings he'd gotten at Maxfield's. So I want you to have this. I want you to, let's be together.
They were best friends in many ways. Kenny had quite a calming effect. They both shared a great love of dogs.
For the first time in his life, he can phone up his mum because she now knows that he's a gay man. So he phones up to let her know that he's met somebody. And of course, she's wonderfully happy about this. But during the same phone call, she also tells him that she's had a cancer scare. And that scare, unfortunately, became a reality, and she sadly died.
I suppose a lot of people would ask the question about why you, as a public figure, as somebody who is recognised, both here and in America, why you take such an outrageous risk?
Well, I suppose that's the whole point, isn't it?
It gets addictive, reckless behaviour, so it becomes to a point sometimes where it becomes you're taking more of a risk, the chance of you being caught, you're doing things more openly.
Beverly Hills police officers arrested the singer, known as George Michaels.
It was a throwback to the 50s. It was agent provocateur. The policeman was actively manipulating himself, which is really wrong. That's entrapment.
There's someone standing there waving their genitals at you. You don't think that they're an officer of the law. It's not your first presumption.
I quite often see celebrities of what I call the bubbles of shame. So their lives are kind of all right, but then they have a moment where they do something really reckless and really foolish, almost as if they want to be exposed.
My reaction to this was, I'm not going to be like another one of these people that's peeking out from behind their net curtains a month later, you know. So I thought, I'm just going to go out for a meal. I know they'll all chase me. I know it will cause, and it did cause havoc. You had all these cars going across red lights, and I was just ambling down to my local restaurant, you know.
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty brave of him to come do something like this.
When you're caught, it's taken the responsibility away from you because it stopped you in your tracks. It's the moment when you have to go sharp and take a breath. What shall I do now?
And I literally got a call the next day going, I'm going to make a song about it. It's kind of like, well, great. It was just the perfect answer. It was the perfect clapback. And I think he just wanted to just go, fuck it, and just reply with a load of humour.
When you get on with somebody and you gel with them, and you've got the same sense of humour, and when you tell somebody an idea, sometimes you tell somebody an idea and it's a blank look, but when you tell George an idea and you see a little sparkle and there's a little smirk, so it was really not George Michael the superstar. It's just like George was in the crew van with all the crew and everyone was chatting to him and he was telling everybody the stories of his life, and he'd be talking about he was in the restaurant with Lady Di, and then he'd see somebody was going to put a parking ticket on his car and he'd go running out to the parking warden and just offering his autograph to get, and it was just really nice little things like that kind of thing. So he'd say, "What are you thinking?" And then it would always be, you know, I'd kind of trigger it, and then I think he had loads of ideas in his head. Then for me, I wasn't quite sure how to portray the whole thing, but all I could see was just this toilet turning into a disco.
Take me to the places that I love best. And yes, I've been back. Doctor, won't you do with me what you can?
And he wanted to kind of develop it more to make a secondary video, which was slightly more hardcore, and a sort of a more hardcore porn version of it running at the same time. He was around maybe 50% of the time on the shots and things like that. Obviously for his scene, he was there all the time. He would just let us go off and do things like, because a lot of it was shot from the air. We wanted people like making out in public, which was like, if it was a lewd scene or something, so it had to be done somewhere where people couldn't see you doing it. And some of it was full penetration as well that we were doing as well. So yeah, that was full on in the control tower.
People like myself trapped in that prison almost. It was a kind of ray of light. It was mocking his tormentors, it was ridiculing, it was making them look ridiculous and absurd.
Like the couple in the van on the top of the cliff. Then we had the other couple who were kissing on top of the mast on the ship. There was his executive producer on it who played the part. He was one of the cops snogging on the roof with his partner. He wanted to use it to let his family know. The idea was to actually expand the video and make a porn movie of it as well. That was the idea, but it never finally got made. I think it got canned.
George, why do you feel compelled to open up a very private part of your life and make it so public?
Well, I feel because I've kind of done that, haven't I? You know, I've done that in a way that I didn't really intend to.
Oh, well, thank fuck for that. Thank fuck that he can actually be himself. Because if he's pretending, we're having to pretend as well. You know what I mean? I don't be sitting there going, "Hey, you see the game, George? Look at the tits on her." You know, it's like, that's pointless.
There were periods, more than a couple, where the country wanted to put their collective arms around George and say, "We like you, it's okay."
And in a way, he was in a situation where the closet door was kicked open, but then he walked through tall and proud.
That's the moment that he will be loved for forever by a generation of gay men.
George had to do community service. So he came here and he was put on dessert duty. And on that day, we were making white cakes as dessert for all of our clients. He really cared about these clients. It wasn't as if he picked a random place to do his community service. It was a place that he had been donating to for 5 years, and it had served people who were dying of AIDS. He was very dedicated to doing this and very serious about it. You know, he celebrated it.
People like George's life aren't accidents. They're purposely designed into the matrix to do what it is that they need to do to move the rest of us forward.
I used to be in charge of the fundraising for the Terence Higgins Trust, biggest AIDS charity around, and I used to have these little dinners. I'd have these big gala ones, but I'd have little ones for the big names, and I remember one where Mick Hucknall and David Gilmour and George, and we were in the little downstairs room at Carluccio's, and I told them about what Terence Higgins Trust needed to keep going, what the work it was doing. And everyone around the table was being extremely generous. And George said, I was thinking maybe not just sort of really write you a check, and my heart slightly sank. But no, he said, I've got this new album, this best of, called Ladies and Gentlemen, this is George Michael. And I thought maybe you could use the UK residuals from that. I said, what do you mean? You mean the money you earn from it? He said, yeah. I said, all of it? He said, yeah, but could you mind, don't tell anybody. So I wasn't allowed to tell anybody, I can tell you now, and people know what an extraordinary man he was, but wow, that generosity. I mean, I cried. I was just simply amazed by it, because he was a sweet, vulnerable, hurting man for most of his life. And yet he had also this giant sort of strength and courage and this ability to say things that would do him harm, as if he wanted, you know, like a child to break its own toys, as if he wanted to break out of the space of stardom and admiration and riches, as if he wanted to be free of that so that he could express something much more primally about himself. And that's almost the definition of an artist.
That there were times in the last 5, 6 years that I was very tempted to just say, you know what, forget it.
It was a 4-year period of just making track after track.
It's too difficult. You're not going to come up with the album that you need.
I think it was just under 1,000 tracks.
And you're driving yourself crazy with it.
I think we'd whittled it down to about 300 tracks that we had on DAT cassettes.
I was almost ready to give up.
Out of those 300, I think 2 ended up forming onto Patience.
The fact that it feels more gay to people is probably due to the fact that my life is more of an open book these days.
By Patience, he was like a blueprint for an elder statesman of pop.
It would be a horrible way to leave my career, to leave people thinking that my sexuality took away my market, because I just knew that wasn't true.
And he's really found his look.
It's really important to say, look, it is not damaging if you have ability. It is not damaging to have the confidence to come out.
Every album, there were enough good songs on it to justify the wait. And I think as long as he kept doing that, his fans were going nowhere.
For my sins, I do check out my fan websites, and they'll say, he sounds a bit gay now, or that bit at the beginning there sounds really kind of gay, and you're just thinking, it sounds exactly like I've always sounded, you know, it's just, you know, I'm gay.
But he just seemed to be cruising at that point into middle-age pop serenity.
I think I have quite a good take on both sexes, maybe because I grew up with 2 sisters, and also because of the relationships I had in my earlier life with women. I kind of, and now having totally, I suppose, I feel totally part of gay culture now.
That level of defiance, he wasn't going to be a sanitised, airbrushed gay man who could have a long at dinner parties, and isn't he so civilised?
Freak, when you think of the public, it was maybe a step too far, commercial public, because it was putting his sexuality out there in such an aggressive way that I think people didn't know how to take it at the time, and it was like a rare commercial misstep for him.
We wanted to do a ballet, which was just like a complete, where George was like the devil, and it just had this big long cock, which was like his tail. And we wanted to do it with the Royal Ballet, with them all covered in tattoos, like glue sniffing. But George was telling me the idea, and he was saying, I want to be Captain FF, which was Captain Fistfucker, and all these things. And I was saying, I'm not quite sure, I can't see how it's going to work. And I didn't get it. I just felt it was the wrong way to go too far to try and get a youth audience in.
Gay people are some of the most interesting people on the planet, because they are born into an environment which is going to be difficult for them, i.e. the world is full of human beings trying to procreate, and that's not what we're here for. If you are strong enough to realise that what you are is not wrong, and yet a large percentage of the world is telling you it is, then you begin to question everything.
Shoot the Dog now is almost a prophetic song because almost everyone now agrees with him on the rights and wrongs of the Iraq War. But he took the stance that was at that time considered very threatening.
Tony Blair has no authority to do this. He's the Prime Minister. He is not someone that we are supposed to follow into lethal situations without asking questions.
I interviewed him in so many different situations. One when he produced his record called Shoot the Dog, which was about the Iraq War in the early 2000s, and he was ranting against George Bush and against Tony Blair.
Came into the studio and he sat down and we opened up the microphone and he just laid into me, into Radio 1, into everything. You know, I mean, he had the forum, it was live radio. He could say what he liked. He had me over a barrel, and you know, when George was on a mission, he was on a mission.
It was a very provocative record. He knew a huge risk with his American career, which wasn't that big by then anyway, so I'm not sure really how big a risk it was, but it was typical George Michael. It was provocative, it was designed to get everybody talking, had a very provocative video with it, and he knew that the media would be very important to him to drive the narrative of that record.
This is about Rupert Murdoch and Mike making what he considered to be statements that were anti-American at this time,
is something that is obviously, I'm the kind of guy that has to be slapped down. And I'm just saying, I won't be slapped down. You might even take away my career, you might manage it, but I know that I'm not gonna let it happen without a fight. And basically, I am going to be in the center of a war of PR with Mr. Rupert Murdoch if he doesn't leave me alone.
It's a fine line, really, between self-destruction and contrariness and bravery. And he exhibits all three to me.
You take on the Murdoch empire, you take on the tabloids at your peril. I mean, they are very patient and very powerful, and they once you've crossed them, they don't forget.
The point that really destroyed him, I think, was when he came out against the Murdoch newspapers, and the Murdoch newspapers went for him. He knew he was going to get eaten alive, and they did.
With George being so upfront about his sex life and defending cruising on Hampstead Heath, with his political songs with a clear, controversial social message, he knew that the tabloids would probably gun for him. And indeed they did.
Possession of cannabis after being found slumped in his car on both occasions. Sky Sarah Hughes reports.
This stuff keeps me sane and happy. I could write without it if I was sane and happy.
Well, this is the worst possible timing for George Michael. He's just started a 28-city European tour. He's only had one date so far, and now, once again, he's in the headlines for something other than his music. The timing is atrocious.
Is it an accident, or is there a possibility that he does it deliberately?
A lot of people speculate that this is someone who just likes the attention.
There was that amount of power that he had at his command, and I think he liked to challenge himself. And I think when you're wanting to be in control, one of the ways to challenge yourself or thrill yourself or entertain himself by putting himself into situations where there was a huge challenge and he could potentially lose control. He would dance on that knife edge.
This is the second time in the year. George.
He did manage to do the thing that he professed to want to do. He destroyed his own star quality, and in doing that, he didn't become any less special. In fact, he became more magical because he became more quantifiable and more knowable to you.
And no drink or drugs in my...
As a journalist, you're aware it's all good fodder. And as a big lifetime fan, it's just desperately upsetting to see that the person that you have always celebrated so much is reduced to becoming that fodder.
I have not cheated or lied about my sex life. Why are those cameras there? To trap an individual in something which is completely normal, commonplace, part of his cultural activity.
He reveled in his own sexuality and felt it was really important to be honest, upfront and open about the fact that he really enjoyed sex.
If you get some sanity back into the idea of privacy, any kind of privacy, right, then the fact that these people are doing this to me is completely immoral.
Watch your legs, guys, watch your legs. Right, watch your feet.
And the Murdoch newspapers were camped outside his house 24 hours a day following. They all knew that he was going to Hampstead Heath cruising. They'd known that for years and years and years. But now they went into overdrive.
Here is the reality of my life, and if you're a straight person, you might not understand why it makes me so happy. I have a career that I love. I live in the most beautiful house I've ever seen. I have a wonderful partner of 10 years. I'm a very, very happy gay man. The fact that I'm portrayed as some kind of loser by straight society is their problem. My problem is that I'm expected to live with people lying constantly. One lie laid on top of another lie, laid on top of another lie, and say nothing.
I was in San Francisco and Kenny, George's partner, was trying to help me get George to contribute to this documentary, and every time I called, he'd say, George isn't sure he wants to do it now. And Anyway, I was going back to England the next day, and Kenny calls and says, George says he wants to do it. And he was living in Dallas, Fort Worth, where he had a place in an art gallery with Kenny. And so I had to divert the flight with the crew, and we stopped off at Dallas. And on the way to his house, he called up and said, "Oh, I can't get my makeup artist. Do you mind if I use yours?" I said, "George, I'm making a documentary series for the BBC. I haven't got a makeup artist. Occasionally, if there's a fleck of something on my mouth, someone will tell me to wipe it away." But he said, "Oh, really?" And it was so sweet. And so he got someone in. And then he came and he started talking about AIDS. And of course, he immediately started saying things that were dark and dangerous and aggressive and angry and political and real. And that's why he'd not wanted to do it. And when he finished, he said, "I knew I shouldn't have talked to you. I'll only get into trouble with this." There goes George shooting his mouth off. And he was, saying how people would respond. And yet, so he was tugged by this need to be absolutely raw and honest, and by this knowledge that it would make his life more difficult, that there'd be headlines, people would say he was arrogant, or he was, self-regarding or something. You just wanted to fold him in your arms.
So now I walk in the day sun. I never thought that my Savior'd come. I think it's amazing. I think it's amazing.
Amazing. It's a good song.
Thank you very
It
much.
really is. You must be very happy with it.
Well, it's kind of unusual to hear me singing about love, really, in the context of, oh, I'm in love, or I'm like, normally it's, I'm so miserable. Love me.
That's a song that I actually enjoy watching people like and everything. Talking about the joys of meeting someone and being in love and how it makes a difference in your life.
This song is really like, I just can't believe how fantastic and life-changing this relationship is.
I didn't want it to look like just some pop star letting his boyfriend have something that he wanted to do and just play with it. So I took it very seriously. Just didn't want it to be a place where very wealthy people came to look at paintings or art. We were very, very philanthropic from the start. So we helped raise a lot of money in general. It's a big part of it. We had one of the most amazing British contemporary art collections in the world. And so to make that full, you can't just be what you like. Art doesn't have to, you don't have to love it. It can move you, it can make you think. It doesn't necessarily always have to evoke happy emotions.
If we're talking about rock music or pop music, making music, also as a form of visual art, it's pretty much always a portrait, a self-portrait. And what you're playing with, by definition, if you're a rock star, is you're playing with the idea of identity. You're playing with the idea of who you are.
He had seen a documentary that Tracy'd done, and we were eating at the Ivy, and he wanted to meet her. So I went over and said, "Hey, can we come over and chat with you?" So we went over and chatted with her, and lifelong friendship.
Some of the Tracy Emin works, they have this blurted confessional quality, this spidery writing, expressing a feeling, floating it out there, seeing what that feeling looks like. Well, to me, that's almost like how George would throw a line out in the studio. Does it sound right? Is that what I really feel?
George Michael is now on a 22-date North American tour, his first in 17 years. Now that California is handing out same-sex marriage licenses, Michael says he and his partner of 12 years, Kenny Goss, might make a trip to the courthouse and say "I do," though not anytime soon. When he toured Europe, every city we went to, I had 25,000 pounds that I could help an organization. For the most part, it was organizations that relate to nurses, children. And so I would research, find an organization, go visit them while I'm there, and then take as many people as possible to the concert that night. And they would get 25,000 pounds as well.
screens at the side he wanted curved, and then this big one that comes over in like a wave, which was expensive.
The production cost was huge, but he never really worried about how much money was in his bank account. He thought you only needed so much money. George's mother was in a National Health Hospital when she had cancer, and the nurses were incredible. He was so impressed, and he wanted to give back, so this wonderful concert for them.
Nice that someone's done something for nurses, because all the time we get abused verbally, physically, and somebody's actually appreciated nurses.
Concerts to put on are very expensive, so I think a lot of times people don't realize you just don't show up. I don't think he ever worried about being behind the music, behind the music or whatever that is, where they tell the story of the washed up, where are they now, and he's working at Wendy's.
Anyway, we came off air, and the editor was waiting for us outside the studio, and she's jumping up and down with excitement because one person's donated 50 grand. And we said, who? She said, it's anonymous, I can't tell you.
And of course, all the philanthropy was secret. It wasn't that he wasn't a great philanthropist, he was a fantastic philanthropist. But he would give with the condition that you don't let people know it's me.
He would see things on television, or hear about something, or read about something.
He would see somebody who needed a new set of glasses or a new set of teeth or something, and he'd call in and he'd do it.
Also about helping friends.
I had a terminal ill child. He had his house in south of France, Chez-Nobby, that's what it was called. There was a helicopter to pick us up and drop us off in the garden.
He was a guy who was looking for ways, like Bill Gates, to give away the money he'd made.
We don't know, so let's go with instinct.
Should we go with C?
C, British.
I'll tell you what, we'll go with C, and if it's wrong, I'll match it so we make it the 64. That way we can't lose, we're going to 64, but we might still be going home.
That's fantastic of you.
We were having a problem making payroll. All of a sudden, a letter appeared at our doorstep that said, "Dear Project Angel Food, keep doing what you're doing. Love, George." He's our single largest donor in the history of Project Angel Food, donating more than $500,000 to us.
When you know that you're making the world a better place, that is a positive feeling that helps lift you through downers.
District Judge John Perkins told George Michael that he'd taken a dangerous and unpredictable mix of drugs. He banned him from driving for 5 years before sentencing him to 8 weeks in prison. There were gasps and tears from fans within the court's public gallery. There were tears too from George Michael's long-term partner Kenny Goss as he left court alone.
The good life got not so good.
Hi, Joe. I think it's decided to do this. Thank you to everybody that supported me in there. It's quite inspirational, and I'm coming out here on my own so that you'll realise I just want to start again. Oh, by the way, I've just thought of a really good idea for a song. So.
Can we get joint credit?
It's not going to be nothing to do with prison.
The thing about George is he hated interviews, didn't really like journalists, but when he did decide to do an interview, he was going to give you everything.
He was almost evangelical about his need to talk about his sexuality.
He was a compulsive truth teller.
And initially, George was there in his sunglasses, quite sort of reserved.
Spliffing his way through the interview, spliffing 1, spliffing 2, spliffing 3.
And then he got more relaxed, the sunglasses came off, the story started flowing.
I think what he still felt guilty about was having taken so long to come out. It was almost an act of penance. And he'd have to tell you everything.
When he talked about the family history and the suicides in the family and the impact of Samuel's death and then his mother's death, and you started to see it all as one, there was this real suffering that he'd been through in his life.
Before that interview, there'd been a tiny, tiny story saying he'd been cautioned for possession of crack. And I found at one point I was becoming like some headmaster to him. And I said to him, George, there was a story about you being caught in possession of crack. And he nodded and again went into denial. And in the end, I said to him, George, look me in the eye. Were you smoking crack that day? And he kind of went, yeah, on that occasion, I was.
With all the fame and with all the money and all the great things as well, there was also this sort of spectre over him, I think, from a lot of his life, of death.
Well, I didn't do that tour because, well, I wasn't sure that he should be out on the road, frankly. But he obviously wasn't well.
You've been going for almost 30 years now, 3 decades. How have you changed as a person from when you started?
Well, I suppose I've got a little bit more fashion sense than when I started. Other than that, I'm pretty much the same, I suppose.
It felt to me like it was something he was doing more for himself. He's positioning himself as someone who had produced a canon and was singing these classics that were the canonical classics of the previous century.
I think one of his things was to work with Phil Ramone on an album. He was very, very in awe of Phil Ramone.
If you go through his career, it's almost as if the camera's just slowly zooming in, and at the end, all you've got is him.
And I think you should probably know the truth behind this one before I sing it.
His songs just got more and more intense, and therefore I think they become less pleasant for him to write.
My battles with various substances are very well documented.
We had the tendency towards the slower, more reflective material, a kind of musical psychiatry.
The truth, Kenny and I have not been together for about 2.5 years, and all I can say is I love him very much, but my love life has been a lot more turbulent than I have let on.
He wrote a song called Where I Hope You Are.
Probably the very first breakup song that I've ever written.
I actually have listened to that song quite a bit, and I didn't know that he was going to, I didn't even know he was going to perform it, so.
So long, there's been no one else I care about.
Living the life you live, you know, with all the focus on you as a person, how does that affect your life?
It's had catastrophic effects on my personal life.
What is so fantastic in your life that you can actually, you know, live the way you do with all
music? If it wasn't music, if I wasn't absolutely driven, and if I didn't find it impossible to live without music, then I wouldn't be doing this anymore.
So you're actually happy?
I'd say I haven't been happy with fame since I was 22, right? So I've wished I was someone else since I was 22, because I hate the effect it has on friendships, on relationships, on your privacy. I hate it, all of it.
George, I'd heard, really loved going to a town, and I got a call from George at 3 in the morning when I got to my hotel, and he was talking about how much he loved the song, how important it was, and it was all, you know, wonderful stuff. But needless to say, he was also very high. And half an hour passed, an hour passed, an hour and a half passed, and then eventually he actually fell asleep. I enjoyed the experience because it was so unusual. I mean, in retrospect, it is quite tragic, you know, because he lost that battle.
I'm going to a town that has already been burned down. I'm going to a place that has already been disgraced. I'm going to see some folks who have already...
He's turned it so completely into a George Michael song that you can almost see him more clearly.
Having George Michael sing that song was one of the high points of my career, and an epic moment that to the end of my days I will refer to, especially being, you know, a gay boy who, you know, at puberty drooled over his behind.
I got streptococcus or something. It's a form of pneumonia, and they spent 3 weeks keeping me alive, basically. The last 10 days since I woke up, literally thanking people for saving my life, which is something I've never had to do before, never wanted to do again.
He was very ill post that time, and I saw him in the immediate aftermath, and he was not a well man. It took him a long time to recover from that. Whether he ever recovered fully or not is open to question.
There was dark demons involved that led him down a dark spiral.
George's family had an uncle who was a depressive, killed himself. And that's a genetic thing. I doubt you can override that to that extent.
It was a self-destruct for reasons that George knows.
One could hypothesize that perhaps it was the death of George's psychoanalyst, therapist, friend, father figure in the form of Barrington Cooper that was a grief too many. That's a very strong ally, somebody who you really trust, who's on your side. On his piano, there was a photograph of Barrington Cooper. Given that the tradition of a grand piano is that you have the photograph of the person you love most in the world or feel most loved by. Barry was an incredibly important figure in George's life, and his death must have brought in an overwhelming amount of grief.
When he dies, there's this very slow progression downhill. And then it seems to go further and further down, and there's nobody else to whom he trusts.
He was putting on weight, he was getting very morose, taking more and more drugs.
Inevitably, the voice did deteriorate.
His voice, which is, I think, after he got pneumonia, was why he, you know, became more depressed.
He was just desperately miserable with his life and who he was. It's just awful.
His descent into drug use, that was the thing, because that was what was destroying him.
The circle of people around him had changed, and they were all part of that same lifestyle.
You know, I know people who work very closely with him who would despair of how he was being.
He was on a downward spiral.
When I had a meeting with him up in the house, but he didn't want to be in it at all. So we went to Barcelona, shot it in a really old vintage fairground in Barcelona. He didn't come with us, and then it was really weird though. So we'd be shooting, and then I'd hear George's voice behind me. I go, what the fuck? And then somebody'd hold a laptop open, and George was on Skype looking at what we were doing, and it was like, oh, hello, mate.
That's a wonderful example of how one musician can bring their history, their story, their persona, their image to someone else's song, and that song becomes something else, and it becomes about George Michael, or it becomes about who we think George Michael might be or might have been.
Let her down easy, her heart is on the line. Let her down easy, and you'll grow up in time.
If you're thinking about art and music, George's music, I think you can think of it all as an astonishing sequence of self-portraits in which the artist George is looking at himself in the mirror each time he comes up with a new song, and he's saying, well, who am I, who are you? And each time there's a different answer. And if you listen to all the songs and you watch all the videos one after the other, you emerge with this wonderful sense of the indeterminacy of a self. The fact that, or the richness, if you like, that how many selves you can be. And I think that's one of the things that people love about it. I think you can see that there's a darkness there a lot. There's a lot of darkness there. And you can conclude from the end of his story that the darkness won. But I always like to think that there are all these other sides, and one of those could have won. It just didn't. You know, such and such happened in a certain period of time, and his demons got the better of him. But they didn't have to, and he left us with so many angels that maybe that's enough anyway.
My name is Yorgos Kyriago Panayotou. That's really how it's said.
It's wonderful.
Yorgos Kyriago Panayotou. To the outside world, I am and always will be known as something else, but it's not my name. As a boy, I haven't read this for ages.
I know.
As a boy, my biggest fear was that my huge ambitions would stay just out of reach of the child I saw in the mirror. So I created a man in the image of a great friend that the world could love if they chose to, someone who could realize my dreams and make me a star. I called him George Michael, and for almost a decade, he worked his arse off for me and did as he was told. He was very good at his job, perhaps a little too good. Anyway, shortly before I was approached with the idea of this book, I decided that his services were no longer required. He went quietly, didn't make a fuss. I know many of you will think that that was a strange thing for me to do, but believe me, he really had to go.